I never thought the hardest word I would ever hear from my own son would be adjust. Daniel said it casually, almost absent-mindedly, like he was asking me to lower the volume on the TV or slide my chair a few inches to the left. "Mom, please adjust," he said, rubbing his temples after another long shift, his eyes already halfway gone somewhere else. I remember forcing a smile, because that's what mothers do when their hearts crack quietly and they don't want anyone to hear the sound. My name is Linda. I'm 62 years old, and I raised my son alone after his father passed away suddenly. There were years when grief sat beside me at the dinner table, years when silence felt heavier than hunger. I worked double shifts, skipped meals without telling anyone, clipped coupons late into the night, and whispered prayers over a sleeping boy who had no idea how hard his mother was fighting for him. I didn't dream of luxury. I only dreamed of peace for him, stability, and a partner who would hold his hand when life got rough instead of pushing others out of the way. So when Daniel married Emily, I truly believed my prayers had finally been answered. She looked perfect, not just on paper, but in the way she presented herself to the world. Polite, educated, soft-spoken. The kind of woman neighbors admire and relatives brag about. In public, she held my arm, called me Mom, told people she was lucky to have me. At family gatherings, she'd praise me loudly, say she hoped she could be half the mother I was someday. Strangers smiled at me and said, "You're so lucky," and I believed them because I wanted to believe them. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something honestly. I want to know how far my painful life story is reaching tonight, so please tell me the name of your city or town in the comments. Knowing where you're listening from right now gives me the strength to keep speaking when my voice wants to disappear. I moved into Daniel and Emily's house after my knee surgery. Daniel insisted. He said it was temporary. He said family sticks together, and this was just one of those phases life throws at you. At first, things felt manageable. Awkward, yes, but I told myself it was just adjustment, the kind everyone talks about. Then slowly, almost quietly, the doors began to close. When Daniel was home, Emily was warm and considerate, asking if I needed anything, laughing softly, playing the role of the perfect wife and daughter-in-law. The moment he left for work, her expression shifted like a switch had been flipped. Her smile vanished. Her voice dropped, colder, sharper. She'd comment on the way I walked, the way I moved through the house, the way I took up space. She rearranged my belongings without asking, and then stared at me like I was confused when I couldn't find them. If I questioned it, she'd tilt her head and say maybe I forgot, maybe my age was finally catching up to me. I started replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I really was becoming difficult, inconvenient, invisible. Looking back now, I understand what she was doing. It was gaslighting, slow and intentional, designed to make me doubt my own reality without ever raising her voice. The first time she humiliated me openly was over something so small it still feels unreal. A glass of water left a few drops on the counter. She sighed loudly, looked at the mess like it was proof of something, and said I had no respect for her home. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was precise, practiced. I apologized even though my hands were shaking, because I didn't want conflict. That night, I heard her laughing with Daniel behind their bedroom door, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that the place I thought was safe no longer felt like home. From then on, every day felt like walking on eggshells. Emily controlled everything. The groceries, the thermostat, the TV. Even when I was allowed to use the washing machine. She'd assign me chores she knew my knee couldn't handle, then complain to Daniel that I was lazy. She'd eat the meals I cooked and later tell him she had to order takeout because I forgot to make dinner. When I tried to explain, Daniel looked exhausted, worn down by work and responsibility. He'd rub his face, avoid my eyes, and say, "Mom, Emily's under a lot of stress. Please adjust." Those words hurt more than anything she ever said. Hearing your own child ask you to shrink yourself just to keep peace in his marriage changes something inside you. If you were in my place, honestly, what would you do? If you feel even a fraction of this pain, please like this video so I know I'm not standing alone in it. Emily never touched me. She never left bruises anyone could see. But her words were sharp and carefully chosen, meant to leave marks only I would carry. She'd say things like, "At your age, you should be grateful anyone puts up with you," or "Daniel will always choose me, so don't get any ideas." I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I stopped cooking foods I liked because she said the smell bothered her. I stopped calling friends because she said I talked too loud. Slowly, I became invisible in a house that existed because of the sacrifices I made to raise the man paying the bills. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I overheard Emily on the phone. Her voice was low, confident, almost amused. She was telling someone how easy it was to manage me, how Daniel believed every word she said, how I was basically a burden she tolerated for appearances. My hands went numb. My chest tightened. And in that moment, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it mixed with something else. Awareness. That night, Daniel came home tired, scrolling through his phone, half listening when I tried to speak. Emily smiled at me across the dinner table, that same fake, sugary smile she showed the world. And I finally understood how deep her control really was. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but the words collapsed in my throat. Silence had become my survival. Still, in that silence, a thought settled deep inside me. I was done breaking quietly. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had eyes, I had memory, and I had time. And time, when paired with truth, has a way of exposing everything. Before I continue, I need to ask you one more thing. Do you believe a mother should sacrifice her dignity just to keep peace in her child's marriage? Please tell me what you think in the comments, because your voice matters to me more than you know. And if you want to hear how this story unfolds, how the truth slowly starts to surface behind those closed doors, make sure you subscribe, because what Emily did next didn't just hurt me, it pushed me toward a decision that would change everything. The thing about awareness is that it doesn't arrive like a warning siren. It slips in quietly, like a cold draft you feel only after the window has been open for too long. I told myself that awareness would protect me, that once I saw Emily clearly, I'd somehow be safe. But awareness didn't bring peace. It brought loneliness. It meant sitting at the kitchen table every morning, coffee going cold, listening to the refrigerator hum like it was the only thing acknowledging my presence. The house didn't change overnight. It changed inch by inch, breath by breath, until one day I realized I was moving more carefully inside my own walls, like I was afraid of triggering something I couldn't name. Emily never raised her voice. She didn't slam doors or throw insults. She didn't have to. She had perfected the art of quiet control, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but still makes you flinch. Cabinets that once held familiar chaos were suddenly rearranged with sharp precision. Little labels appeared, written in neat handwriting, as if order itself were a moral virtue and deviation a personal flaw. When I opened the wrong door, even accidentally, Emily's eyes would flick toward me for half a second too long, and I'd feel like a child being silently corrected. The fridge became another battlefield disguised as organization. Food was divided, portioned, categorized. Daniel's favorite snacks always stayed stocked. Emily's meals were planned and prepped like a lifestyle blog. And then there was my corner, small, inconsistent, constantly shifting. Sometimes the food I bought disappeared. Sometimes it reappeared days later, moved just enough for me to doubt my own memory. When I asked about it, Emily would tilt her head, soft concern painted across her face, and say things like, "I thought you said you didn't want that anymore," or, "Maybe you're just stressed, Linda." Daniel noticed none of this. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to engage. He was a good man in many ways, but goodness without courage turns passive fast. He believed that keeping the peace meant staying neutral, that not choosing sides made him mature. He didn't understand that neutrality, in a controlled environment, always favors the controller. He'd brush things off with a laugh, tell me I was overthinking, remind me that Emily was just trying to help. And every time he said that, something inside me shrank a little more. Emily knew exactly how to weaponize that. In front of Daniel, she was attentive, respectful, endlessly polite. She called me Mom with just enough sweetness to sound sincere. But the moment he left for work, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically. Just subtly enough to be deniable. Her footsteps sounded heavier. Her sighs louder. She'd clean aggressively around me, wiping surfaces I'd just touched, muttering about hygiene and routine. She started planting stories, small ones at first. How I forgot to lock the door. How I mixed up dates. How she worried I might hurt myself without meaning to. Each comment was wrapped in concern, but together they formed a narrative. And the most dangerous part? I started hearing that narrative in my own head. The medication incident was the moment my fear became real. One morning, my pills weren't where they'd been for years. Same bottle. Same routine. Gone. I searched quietly, heart pounding, until Emily appeared behind me like she'd been waiting. She found them later in a different drawer, laughing lightly, touching my arm like she was comforting a child. "You really don't remember putting them there?" she asked, eyes full of worry. I laughed too. I had to. Because denying it would make me sound defensive, and defense was already being framed as instability. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay there staring at the ceiling, realizing this wasn't forgetfulness. It was strategy. Control disguised as care. Gaslighting dressed up as concern. And for the first time, another thought crept in, cold and terrifying. If she could make me doubt myself this easily, how long before Daniel did too? How long before this house decided I didn't belong here anymore? I wasn't collecting revenge. I was collecting truth. Quietly. Carefully. I started paying attention to patterns. Timing. Tone. The way Emily's kindness always had witnesses, and her cruelty never did. I noticed how she positioned herself as indispensable, how she slowly took over responsibilities that once gave me purpose, leaving me idle and invisible. With every day, the fear sharpened. Not just fear of Emily, but fear of what could happen if her version of reality became the only one Daniel heard. If you've ever felt someone slowly rewriting your image while smiling to your face, I want to know. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I need to know how far this feeling travels. And when I realized that the ground beneath me could vanish without warning, that my place in this family was no longer guaranteed, I made a choice. I didn't confront. I didn't explode. I observed. Because sometimes survival isn't about fighting back. It's about staying steady long enough to see the cracks forming in the person who thinks they're untouchable. If you were in my place, knowing you might be pushed out of your own home by silence and smiles, would you leave quietly or stay and watch closely? If you'd stay, hit like, not to support me, but to stand with yourself. And if this kind of quiet tension, this slow tightening of control, feels familiar to you, make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming next isn't loud revenge or sudden chaos. It's the first mistake. The first slip. The moment Emily doesn't realize she's being seen. The days that followed felt heavier, like the air itself had learned how to judge me. Even the quiet had weight now. I moved slower, not because my body had weakened, but because my mind had sharpened. Awareness had changed the way I walked through rooms, the way I listened to silence, the way I read expressions that used to pass unnoticed. Emily was tightening something unseen, and I could feel it the way you feel pressure change before a storm. Rules began appearing without warning, like invisible lines drawn across the floor. Shoes had to be placed a certain way, toes aligned. Towels folded with the seam hidden. Lights turned off by a specific hour, even if someone was still awake. If I missed one, she never corrected me directly. She would sigh, fix it herself, and later casually mention to Daniel how hard it must be for me to keep up with routines these days. Daniel would nod, rubbing his temples, already exhausted, already halfway gone somewhere else. I watched how Emily positioned herself during conversations, always standing just a little closer to him, always touching his arm when she spoke about me, as if concern needed physical proof. It was smooth, almost impressive. And slowly, I felt my authority thinning, like fabric worn down by constant friction. I wasn't being attacked. I was being edited out. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone in the backyard. She didn't know I was near the window. Her voice was soft, controlled, almost amused. She was talking about me, about how aging changes people, about how it's probably best to start planning early. I didn't hear the word out loud, but I felt it land anyway. Replacement. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since my husband passed. That night, I couldn't eat. My hands shook as I washed my plate, realizing this wasn't discomfort anymore. This was displacement in progress. If you've ever felt like your place in your own family was slowly being erased without anyone raising their voice, I want to know. Please tell me in the comments which city or town you're watching from, because I need to understand how many of us are living inside this quiet fear. The next shift came quietly, the way most dangerous things do. Emily started managing information. Mail arrived already opened. Bills were handled. Appointments were rescheduled. Messages were forgotten. She told Daniel she was just helping because I seemed overwhelmed lately. Daniel, worn down by work and convinced peace meant avoiding tension, let her. I watched my independence dissolve under the excuse of care. The worst part wasn't the control itself. It was the loneliness of being disbelieved before I even spoke. I started keeping mental notes. Dates. Phrases. Expressions. The way Emily's tone changed depending on who was in the room. I didn't write anything down yet. Not because I didn't want proof, but because I wasn't ready to admit to myself how far this might go. Still, I remembered everything. Every correction made with a smile. Every decision made on my behalf. Every moment she spoke for me before I could open my mouth. One evening at dinner, Emily mentioned casually that maybe it wasn't safe for me to be alone in the house anymore. She said it lightly, like she was commenting on the weather. Daniel froze for half a second. I saw it. That pause told me the idea hadn't started at the table. It had started earlier, somewhere quieter. The room felt like it tilted. I smiled through the rest of the meal, because I understood something important then. Resistance without preparation only speeds up removal. That night, lying awake, I made a decision that scared me almost as much as staying silent. I would stop reacting. I would stop correcting. I would let Emily believe her version of me was complete. Because sometimes the safest move is letting the person who thinks they're in control grow careless. I began reclaiming myself quietly. I spent more time outside the house. I reconnected with people Emily didn't manage. I listened more than I spoke. I watched patterns instead of moments. And then it happened, the first mistake. Emily slipped because she thought the narrative was finished. She contradicted herself in front of Daniel, just slightly, about something she had blamed on my forgetfulness weeks earlier. Daniel didn't confront her. He didn't argue. But something shifted in his eyes. Confusion. Doubt. The beginning of denial cracking. Emily noticed it too. From that moment on, she watched me differently. Not with confidence, but with calculation. She sensed something had changed, even if she couldn't name it. And standing there, watching them both, I felt something unexpected settle in my chest. Not victory, not revenge, but clarity. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was underestimated. And if you were standing where I was, realizing the truth might finally surface, but knowing it could still cost you everything, would you stay quiet a little longer or speak up immediately? If you understand that kind of choice, hit like, not for me, but for anyone who's ever had to protect themselves with patience. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting to fear. I was preparing for truth. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've lived inside silence that tried to swallow you whole, make sure you're subscribed because what comes next isn't loud or dramatic. It's the slow moment when control starts collapsing from the inside. And before we move forward, I want to ask you once more, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because knowing how far this truth travels reminds me that I'm not standing alone anymore. After that night, nothing exploded. And that's how I knew things were finally getting dangerous. Calm returned to the house, but it wasn't peace. It was surveillance disguised as normalcy. Emily smiled more, spoke softer, offered help before anyone asked. Daniel noticed it too, even if he didn't say it out loud. His silences became longer, heavier, like he was replaying moments in his head and realizing they didn't line up the way he remembered. I could see it in the way his eyes lingered when Emily corrected me, in the way he stopped nodding automatically. Doubt had entered the room, and Emily felt it. She began tightening her version of the story, not by adding drama, but by repeating concern. She told friends I was adjusting. She told relatives I was having trouble with transitions. She told Daniel she was just trying to protect everyone. And the scariest part was how reasonable it sounded. I understood then that truth alone wouldn't save me. Truth needed witnesses. It needed timing. It needed proof that couldn't be brushed off as confusion. So I started collecting quietly. Not revenge. Not confrontation. Just reality. I kept my phone nearby, not to record people, but to record patterns. Dates. Times. The way instructions changed depending on who was listening. I took photos of notes left for me that contradicted what Emily later claimed she had said. I saved messages that disappeared from shared threads but remained in notifications. I watched her grow more confident, more careless, because she believed the narrative was already written. Daniel started asking small questions. Harmless ones. Where did that message go? When did we decide that? Emily answered smoothly, but her tone shifted when she realized he wasn't fully convinced anymore. The house felt like it was holding its breath. One afternoon, while Daniel was at work, Emily confronted me in the kitchen. Not angrily, calmly. She said she felt overwhelmed. That she didn't feel supported. That maybe it was time we discussed other living arrangements. She framed it like kindness, like a favor. I listened without interrupting, without defending myself. I nodded. And for the first time, she looked unsettled. Because she expected resistance. She expected emotion. Instead, she got stillness. If you've ever sat in a room realizing someone was deciding your future without raising their voice, I want to know, please tell me in the comments which city or town you're watching from, because knowing I'm not the only one who's felt this helps me breathe through it. That evening, Daniel came home early. Emily didn't expect that. She repeated the conversation in a lighter tone, leaving out the parts about arrangements and burden. This time I spoke. Just one sentence. I said we could talk about it together, since it affected all of us. Daniel looked at Emily. She hesitated. Just for a second. Long enough. That was the moment. Not loud. Not dramatic. But real. Later that night, Daniel asked me if everything was okay. Not accusing. Not defending. Just asking. I told him I was fine, but that I'd like him to stay in the room the next time concerns were discussed. He agreed. Emily didn't smile after that. She began testing boundaries faster, pushing decisions through without discussion, assuming momentum would protect her. That's when she made the mistake she couldn't undo. She referenced a doctor's recommendation that never happened. Daniel asked which appointment. Which date? Emily froze. She laughed it off, said she must have misspoken. But the air had already shifted. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't defend me either. He went quiet. And silence, I had learned, was where truth finally had space to grow. That night, I realized something painful but empowering. I might still lose the house. I might still be asked to leave. But I would not leave erased. And if you were in my place, knowing you could be pushed out quietly, knowing speaking too soon could destroy everything you were trying to protect, would you prepare your exit with dignity or fight immediately? If you understand that choice, hit like, not because you agree with me, but because you know how heavy that decision is. Emily sensed the shift immediately. She became sharper, more rushed. Her control was no longer invisible, it was defensive. Daniel started reviewing messages, checking dates, asking follow-ups. And I stayed exactly where I was, calm, observant, underestimated. Because sometimes the strongest move isn't confrontation. It's letting the truth stack up until it can't be ignored. If you want to see what happens when concern turns into exposure and silence stops protecting the wrong person, make sure you're subscribed. What comes next isn't revenge. It's consequence. And before we go further, tell me once more in the comments where you're watching from, because every voice reminds me this story isn't just mine anymore. By the time the truth came out, no one raised their voice. That's what surprised everyone the most. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a scene. It was a quiet unraveling, the kind that happens when lies finally run out of places to hide. Daniel sat at the dining table, his phone face down, his shoulders tense in a way I hadn't seen before. Emily stood near the counter, arms crossed, already defensive, already rehearsing explanations that no longer mattered. I didn't speak at first. I didn't need to. Daniel did. He asked her about the doctor. About the message that disappeared. About the date she mentioned that never existed. One by one, the questions came, calm but precise. Like someone checking the foundation of a house they were no longer sure was standing. Emily answered quickly at first, then slower, then not at all. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting. I realized then that this wasn't about winning. It was about being seen. And for the first time since that word adjust was spoken, I was fully visible. Daniel finally turned to me and asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told him the truth. That every time I tried, I was made to sound confused. That every concern was labeled worry. That silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Emily interrupted, said I was exaggerating, said I had always been sensitive. Daniel didn't argue with her. He simply looked at his phone and showed her the screenshots. The notes. The dates. The contradictions she forgot she had created. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Not anger. Fear. Because control only works when no one checks the facts. I want to pause here and ask you something honestly. Have you ever watched someone rewrite your reality right in front of you? If you've lived through that, please tell me in the comments which city or town you're watching from, because knowing how far this story reaches gives me the strength to keep telling it. Daniel stood up, walked to the window, and stayed there for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. He said he didn't recognize the home he'd been living in. He said peace built on someone else shrinking wasn't peace at all. Emily tried one last time, saying she only wanted harmony, that she was just trying to hold things together. Daniel shook his head and told her harmony doesn't require one person disappearing. That night, no one was thrown out. No doors slammed. Emily packed a bag on her own. Not because she was forced, but because the story she controlled no longer existed. Watching her leave didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there, breathing, realizing the house felt lighter than it had in years. Daniel sat beside me and apologized, not with excuses, but with understanding. He admitted he chose comfort over confrontation, silence over truth. That was his reckoning. Mine was different. I realized I had survived something that could have erased me, and I didn't let it. If you were in my place, knowing you could have stayed quiet forever just to keep the peace, but chose truth instead even when it risked everything, would you do the same? If your answer is yes, press like. Not for me, but for every person who's ever been told to adjust while being slowly pushed aside. In the days that followed, the house didn't magically become perfect. There were awkward silences, half-finished conversations, moments when grief showed up without warning. But there was honesty. And honesty, I learned, doesn't heal quietly at first, it heals steadily. Daniel began listening in a way he hadn't before, not just hearing words, but watching expressions, pauses, things left unsaid. I started doing something I hadn't done in years. I made small plans that belonged only to me. Morning walks that weren't explained to anyone. A class I'd once postponed because someone else needed the time more than I did. A notebook where I wrote thoughts without correcting myself first. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of return. Daniel told me I didn't have to leave, that this was my home too. I thanked him, but I told him something important. I said dignity isn't about staying or going. It's about choice. And this time, the choice was mine. I stayed, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I no longer felt small where I stood. Emily's absence didn't fix everything overnight, but honesty did something powerful. It gave us ground to rebuild on. Not perfect, just real. And that was enough. I also knew something else now. Even if one day I chose a different place, a smaller apartment, a quieter life, I would take myself with me whole. Not adjusted. Not minimized. Whole. Before this story ends, I want to ask you one last thing. Do you believe a mother should sacrifice her dignity to keep a marriage intact, or should truth always come first? Tell me in the comments what you think, because these conversations matter more than silence ever did. And if you followed this journey from the beginning and you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, make sure you're subscribed. Not for drama, not for revenge, but for truth, the kind that survives closed doors and quiet control. Because sometimes the strongest ending isn't destruction. It's being left standing, fully seen, and finally respected.